Well, here we are sitting on the apron in a DHC de Havilland 2 piston Beaver. It's sitting on amphibious floats, and that configuration is what I'm most familiar with, so that's what I chose. But we're going to do startup, taxi, and circuit just on wheels. Another video will show water operation. So to get started, we'll go over the controls. For the most part, the simulator allows us to start this up in a normal, realistic fashion, so I'll try and go over. Now, with any radial engine, the lower cylinders are subject to oil leaking past the rings and collecting in around where the bottom where the spark plugs are. Now that's hydrolock. That prevents the pistons from doing their full travel in the lower cylinders. And if you try and start the engine with the electric starter, well, oil doesn't compress, so something's going to give. And you could break the starter or the ring. So first thing in the morning, pull the propeller through by hand and make sure that there is no oil accumulating so that the engine's free and clear. If so, pull the plugs and drain the oil. So we'll assume that we've done that and that we know it'll turn over correctly. Now we're checking travel of the controls, ailerons, elevator, and rudder movement. Now, because it's also a float plane, the water rudders move with the foot pedals and the air rudder. And then if we're in the water, we could drop the rudders down with the cable and the D-ring or pull them up. So now we're in the cockpit, and we'll do our left and right aileron, elevator, forward, backwards, and rudder pedals left and right. There's the D-ring with the cable for lowering the rudder, water rudders, which of course we're not going to use, so we'll keep them up. So we'll put the mixture to full rich, propeller to full fine, and crack the throttle for starting. There's the flap indicator. So for takeoff, we'll be using a takeoff setting. Right now we're in cruise setting. Fuel selector, we're on the center tank. There's the forward tank and the reverse tank, or the rear tank, and then straight down is off. But we'll leave it on the rear tank because I want to make sure that it's flowing free and clear. But on takeoff, we'll go to center tank. This is the wobble pump. It puts about 1 or 2 psi pressure in the fuel system so that the primer will work. It's indicated on that gauge there, so we'll flick on the battery and we can see it's up to about 2 or 3 psi. Any more than that and it could blow O-rings out of the seals. Now hiding down here on the floor is the primer. So now that we got fuel to the primer, we'll give it about 6 to 10 pumps to prime the cylinders. And like any radial, we're going to spin the engine over about 6 blades before we click on the mags, and that'll help draw fuel into the cylinders. So we'll flick the mags off. They were set on for I don't know what reason, but we're off now. Put the generator on. And get ready to start. We'll see if it goes the first time here. So 6 blades, flick the mags on. Nope, I'll try it again. There we go. Okay, it's running. Immediately check oil pressure, make sure it's coming up. Oil temp will come up when it warms up. Check the switches. Now, the lighting switches, strobe lights, all the necessary avionics will be switched on for takeoff. Now we'll check field elevation, should be 680 feet, so I'll just tweak it up here a bit. The gyro compass is way off. We'll set that once we get the vacuum up and the engine's been running for a bit. but this is how we'll set it. And we set it to the magnetic compass like any gyro. If the plane is straight and level cruise, then it's a good thing to check with the magnetic compass periodically. The gyro does tend to drift. And like any mechanical or a gyro compass, it's there because it remains stable during turns, climbs, and descent, whereas the magnetic compass will spin, and you can't use it very well if you're trying to set up a new course. So we're just about ready to taxi. Once again, we're really using a checklist like any aircraft, but for the sake of the video we're concentrating really just on the main points without going over every single item. So this is okay for a sim pilot, but this is not what you would do for real. You'd follow your checklist and make your radio calls, file your flight plan. So we're throttling up and we'll stop short of the runway, do a visual check for traffic. So there's our lighting and so on. We'll say that it's all set. So we'll have strobes switched on once we're airborne. Beacon can be on right away. Any clearance lights should be on. Landing light for takeoff and landing. And if you're at night, of course, taxi lights. So we'll do a full stop here. And we'll check for traffic. On this particular simulator, views out the windows are a little difficult, so we'll assume that we've looked for traffic in that direction and that direction. And safe to proceed. We've made our radio calls and we're going to backtrack runway 02. Winds appear to be calm, so controlling the ailerons if it was gusty or windy is necessary, but today that's not an issue. So we get the plane rolling at a comfortable speed and then throttle back and let the plane coast. Once we're at the end of the runway, there's a turnaround bay, and turnaround bays are still part of the active runway. We'll do our run-up in there. If there's a double line, it's not a turnaround bay, it's a holding bay. But this is an uncontrolled aerodrome, nothing fancy here. There are no lines, so we're still part of the active doing our run-up. So we're throttling back so we don't go too fast. Now, just before takeoff, we'll return to the center tank, and then choosing the tank in the air is pilot's discretion. I just happen to know, let's say, and I'm pretending here it's a simulator, that the rear tank has fuel that we would like to use up. Now, because we're on amphib floats, differential braking is essential for turning. There is no nose wheel steering on this aircraft with this configuration. So we're pointing just about right so our prop blast doesn't affect anything. Set the brakes, and the run-up is pretty standard. So what we've got down here is the flap selector lever, up and down, and then the hydraulic pump for pumping it into that position. So we'll do that now and get the flaps ready for takeoff. We're now in cruise position, so we'll pump it down. And one more time. There we go. We're in takeoff. Immediately after takeoff, we'll pump them up one stage to climbing flaps. So we're setting the gyros, setting to the compass, checking elevation, flap settings correct. Okay, we'll do our run-up and mag check. Mag check checks both mags and makes sure that they can be shut off to kill the engine. So everything looks good, and we'll throttle up to 1500 RPM. Now I can't quite see the tachometer there, so let's slide over a bit. There we go. So there, we're heading to 1500 RPM. Feet firmly on the brakes. You don't use the parking brake for this necessarily. So we'll do right mag check, no more than 50 RPM drop, and back to both. Go to left mag, no more than 50 RPM drop, back to both. And then we'll do a dead mag check, so right off, back onto both. So everything's performing normally, checking the switches are in where they should be, fuel selectors where it should be, and we'll check the prop. Slowly pull it back until the RPM begins to drop, and then put it back. There you go. That's easy on the gyro, or on the governor. Some pilots are trained to pull it right off to the maximum full course. That's really hard on the governor, so a good mechanic would know that. So it's not necessary, in my opinion. So, ready to taxi? We'll taxi into position with a bit of throttle, feet off the brakes, except for steering. So we'll spin around, harden the left brake, so we'll check for traffic. So nobody's coming in unannounced. And hard on the right brake, and we'll pivot back straight down the runway. Amphibious wheels, there are 4 of them. The front 2 float tips are casters, so you use differential braking for steering. There we go. So we'll get ready to throttle up. Everything looks in good shape. Full power. So right, full forward, right rudder a bit to keep it straight down the runway, and it'll quickly come up to 60 and rotate. That doesn't take much. Beavers have short takeoff and landing. Positive rate of climb, retract the wheels. Throttle down to 30 inches, pull the propeller down to 21 RPM, and raise the flaps to climbing flaps. Now the trim wheel is in the takeoff position, so everything should be trimmed. You shouldn't have to change it much. The trim wheel is above you in the center, together with the rudder trim. So you reach up with your right hand and twist the wheels on the side for elevator trim. So pretty much trimmed there. See, there they are there. See, there's 2 wheels, and the one in the center is rudder trim. So you can fly from either seat. You can grab the wheel easily. So we'll do our turn. It climbs fast, so we're already past 500 feet above ground, so we're turning a bit late. And we'll get up to circuit altitude is around 2,000 feet. It's actually 1860, but 2,000 is a nice round number. So we're heading 90 degrees from the runway, which is a heading of 290, and we have it on the gyro, we're pretty close to it. On our downwind, we're heading 200 degrees, so we're pointing at the mouth of a bay on that big lake. So it's a good reference. Looking ahead at a landmark is much better than following the gyro. So now we're throttling back to 21 inches and 1900 RPM and cleaning up the flaps to cruise. Make our turn on the downwind, rolling out at 200 degrees. We're at circuit altitude, which takes us right over Turtle Lake here, aiming straight at the mouth of the bay on that distant lake. And we'll roll out. So we should be parallel to the runway to the left. Now we're going to drop the wheels, getting ready for landing. So about mid downwind, you can drop the landing gear when the speed is below 100. And there we are. It should be coming down soon. We're doing our downwind checks, making our radio calls as usual. And we're going to pitch up, throttle back a bit, slow the plane down, and drop flaps, getting ready to go down to landing flaps. So the gear's down. When the south end of the runway threshold is at our 7 o'clock position, we can make our left turn onto base leg for landing. So we're dropping the flaps down to landing flaps. Airspeed's about 80 knots. Throttle back, propeller to full fine for landing. Always in full fine in case you have to throttle up and climb fast. So the propeller is already set. So we'll turn to a heading of 100 degrees perpendicular to the runway, descending 500 feet a minute or so at 80 knots. There's the runway threshold. You can tighten up your circuit with a Beaver because they perform and climb pretty fast and descend fast. So now we're dropping down to about 75 knots. We're almost at full flaps, pumping down, descending at 700 feet a minute and making a slow turn on to final. So we're not lined up with the runway, but the Beaver is doing what is kind of almost a typical water landing where there you go. And we're approaching 75 knots, slowing down to 60. Level a plane out, let it settle onto the runway, power full off, and on the main gear, straight down the runway. When you have time, you can pull the flaps up, full braking. It doesn't take much to stop these. They land pretty quickly. So flaps are clean. Let's take a look at how little runway we used. Now normally you don't sit there and admire your airplane. You clear the active as quickly as you can. So this is not really normal. But I don't see anybody in the area, so we can probably get away with it. So let's throttle up and go park this thing. Feet off the brakes, throttle up and get taxiing. So probably on the approach, what I could have done better is make my turn on to final a little later. But what I did do was a gradual turn so I could see the end of the runway and then judge to come in. Not exactly perfect recommendation for any pilot. It's always a better idea to turn on to final with a lot of distance so that you have time to line up, set up your descent. What I did there was a little bit more of like a bush flying landing where but it's, if you're new at this, it's better to extend your downwind a bit, turn on to final as straight in line as you can, and then you have lots of time to set up your final and your descent. So I've made a full stop, made my radio call to announce clear the active, and let's go park this at the pumps. Now again, it's a calm day, so I'm not worrying too much about managing the ailerons and elevator. If it was a windy day, then it's something you should do all the time to make sure that the wind doesn't lift your wing. So we'll park up by the pumps here, full stop, and we'll do a shutdown. So like any aircraft, normal shutdown, kill the engine using mixture. So mixture, full lean. And the prop will stop, and magneto's off, fuel selector off, and battery and generator off. And that's it.